Sasha up on the screen? Yep. Okay, great. So Sasha Costanza-Chock is perhaps familiar to many of you, but she is a researcher, designer and activist and author of Design Justice, Community-Led Practices to Build the Worlds We Need, which was published with MIT Press in 2020 and is available open access, which is great. Sasha is also on the steering committee member of the Design Justice Network and an associate professor in the College of Arts, Media and Design at Northeastern University. So we're going to run this session today as an interview. So Matthew and I are going to ask Sasha some questions, and we've got some prepared, but we're hoping to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So put your thinking caps on, and over to you first, Matthew.
Yeah, so Sasha, it's really an honor and a privilege to have you here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So we thought we'd start with some general discussions about design justice. And one thing that strikes me when you sort of read the design justice principles for the first time, they're very aspirational. But what I appreciate about your work is that it showed like concrete ways that you can use the design justice principles as a kind of rubric, as a set of goals that you can use to critique and improve your own design practices. What I'd like to do is start by inviting you to talk about your approach to design justice and give some examples about how it leads to insights, changes, and hopefully improvements in the way you and your colleagues approach design projects.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I wish that I was able to be there in person, but I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to get into today. So yeah, in terms of this first one, maybe it's really worth talking a little bit about how the Design Justice Network principles, were not created primarily as something in the abstract. So it shouldn't be a surprise that they're useful for real-world design practice. The Design Justice Network principles come out of a community of practice that formed at the Allied Media Conference back in 2015, and then again in 2016. There were a series of workshops that were organized by Yuna Lee, who's the principal at a design shop called And Also Too, and Jenny Lee, who at the time was the one of the co-directors of Allied Media Projects, which is the organization that hosts the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, which was a conference that ran for almost 3 decades. That was an incredible meeting place for cultural workers and activists and organizers and technologists and designers and architects and musicians and all kinds of people doing sort of creative work that was connected to movement work. So back in 2015, 2016, Yuna Lee and Jenny Lee and Wes Taylor, who I believe is there in the audience, and a number of other people organized a series of workshops initially to kind of critique what was common at the time, a kind of framework of design for social good. So there were a lot of projects that were designed for social good in the, around that time. But, the organizers of those workshops had a lot of questions around, good for who? What is the organizing framework here? Who's involved in these projects that are supposed to be designed for good projects, and who's really benefiting from them, and who's being harmed? And so that original workshop that was called Generating Principles for Design Justice sort of took several design for good projects that were popular in Detroit at the time. Like, for example, there was one that was, a coat for unhoused people that could convert into a tent. And And there was another one that was a high-end luxury bicycle, but it would be produced all through sort of local parts and labor in the city of Detroit. And so there were a number of these projects that were popular at the time that were getting a lot of press, a lot of visibility. And the workshop at Allied Media Conference was to kind of critique these projects, and then, really through this simple lens of these sort of three intersecting circles of, who participated in this project, who benefited, and who was harmed. And then after doing that critique of these design for good projects, to then try and come up with a set of principles that would reach deeper than a sort of fuzzy design for good rubric or practice, and instead to try and come up with some principles that could guide us towards doing work that's really rooted in and led by community, that builds upon existing strengths, that doesn't always assume or doesn't come from a needs-based or a weakness-based framework, but that actually uses an assets-based framework and understands that communities that face intersecting oppression often have had to come up with design solutions or workarounds or ways of being, for decades or even for centuries, and how can we build upon those? And generally, how can we, shift our position as designers from experts who hold all the knowledge and will bring it like Prometheus to the community to, facilitators and allies and co-conspirators, and how can we accompany communities in the process of designing objects, tools, campaigns, processes, systems that might really be helpful and not harmful, that might be controlled by the community, and that don't simply participate in a kind of hand-wavy design for good approach. So that's where the principles came from this series of workshops at Allied Media Conference, from a community of practice that was already deeply involved in doing design work connected to social movements. So with that background, I think it shouldn't be surprising that the principles are useful to a lot of different kinds of people doing different types of work. They don't primarily come from an academic place. They weren't generated were involved in organizing the Design Justice Network principles from the start continue to do their design practice on the daily basis, and are using those principles in different types of work. So for example, I just spoke a little bit about Una Lee, who is the principal at a design shop called And Also Too. And her design shop continues to be active, and they're continuing to do a lot of really wonderful work with different movement groups and community groups and community-based organizations. There's a really beautiful project that they did with First Nations youth in the what's called Toronto today, around that area, where they did a sort of report on Native youth organizing, and some of the work that the groups she was involved with were doing. And that report is called Feathers of Hope. And she has a case study up on the And Also Too website that talks about the design process that they used to produce the cover graphics for Feathers of Hope, and a series of sort of brainstorming sessions they did to figure out what types of visual language they wanted to use, that ended up leading to cover art that I don't have it here to sort of pull up for you, but you can find it on andalso2.net. And they ended up producing this really beautiful and ghostly cover imagery that involves smoke coming from sage that's passing through different sort of paper screens that they created. And yeah, so that's one example from the field of graphic design where the Design Justice Network principles continue to inform the work of the studio and also too, and they go in depth into, what's the process they use to make sure that the visual representation really came from the group of youth organizers that they were working with. They really feel ownership over it. And then beyond feeling ownership over it, I think it's important to think about how design justice processes also attend to agreements between designers and communities that are involved in design work, where you want to think about um, so-called intellectual property or the right to reproduce and distribute, the work. Design justice processes also attend to, if there's going to be revenue generated from the thing that you've produced together, how is that going to be shared, or who's going to own the revenue? And then how is the story of the design work that you did together going to circulate? Who's going to be invited to talk about it? Who's going to be visible in the story? Who's going to be considered, co-authors of the design work? So yeah, those are all some factors that are important in doing design justice work. I gave one example from graphic design. I could give another example. Maybe let's give one more and then stop, move on to the next question. But there's another project that I really love that is informed by the Design Justice Network principles that comes from a collective called the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck Collective. And this is a group of designers and technologists and engineers and community organizers who got together 5-6 years ago, thinking about how initially they were thinking about how breast pump technology has not evolved in a long time, and people who use breast pumps often find them uncomfortable and noisy and not well designed, and there's all types of ways that they might be improved. So they decided to organize a hackathon around breast pumps, and they organized one, and they paid a lot of attention to how to ensure that different types of people could be present, how to make sure that there's childcare so that mothers with young children would be able to attend, or parents of young children who are breastfeeding would be able to attend. And they had to figure out breast pumping stations for people who are currently actively breast pumping, and they had to figure out basically just thinking a lot about the accessibility needs and how to meet people's access needs during the event. But even beyond that, once they ran the first event, a lot of the attendees were telling them things like, it is important to innovate upon the breast pump technology, but also a lot of what's keeping people from being able to effectively use breast pumps, it's not just the technology itself, it's not the device innovation, it's also about workplaces don't have spaces where you could use these things, or don't have a policy that enables someone to take some time out of their busy workday to go and actually do the pumping, or so they started to really think about how there's a whole policy component and there's also a whole cultural component of what are all the things that need to happen to make people comfortable with breast pumping and also with breastfeeding. And so the second year that they organized the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck hackathon, they evolved it into the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck Hackathon and Policy Summit. And so the second time around, they invited a lot of people, who are working on policy around reproductive justice and maternal care and breastfeeding policy and infant care. And the other thing that happened as they evolved this process was, so sort of moving from just like the whole focus is on the device to zooming out a little bit to also what are the structural constraints and what are the policy components and what are the negative cultural constraints that are blocking people from having a good experience, um, with feeding their infants. And the other thing that they then sort of did to evolve the whole process was initially, this was an event that was taking place at the MIT Media Lab, although they were inviting a lot of community organizers and people from different places. Um, the press about the event kept focusing on the devices and kept focusing on MIT, MIT, MIT. And that's because MIT as an institution has, excellent press machinery. And so, of course, they're going to do everything they can to insert a narrative around, the genius of the device innovation that's happening at MIT, even though what they were learning in the actual process is that there was a lot of policy work that had to happen, a lot of community work that had to happen, a lot of cultural shift that had to happen. And so the next year, they shifted the location and they moved it to Detroit. And it was connected to the Detroit Black Mothers Breastfeeding Association and Harambee Care Collective and a number of other community-based organizations that are really working with the reproductive justice framework, focusing on, there's a real racial disparity in maternal mortality and in access to infant care and to breastfeeding and so on and so forth. So over time, they shifted to make the space more accessible and more inclusive. They shifted to broaden the frame from just the device to also the policy pieces. And they also shifted the narrative and shifted the actual venue from a, multi-billion-dollar institution known for innovation to, community-controlled spaces where community members who are most harmed by disparities in access, um, to childcare and to infant care and to breastfeeding, um, could feel more comfortable and could actually better own the process and the story of the process. So those are two examples from different domains that I like that are around sort of practices that can be informed by the Design Justice Network principles and how that's showing up in different types of work.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear how there are so many tendrils spreading out from just the one question, but also how a project can change over time in response to the groups that are coming together to have conversations around it. So, as you know, I mean, this meeting is about taking a design justice approach specifically to AI. How do you see the specific challenges of AI for design justice? And are there any projects, and these could be your own or they could be other ones, that have been particularly effective in this space that you'd like to tell us about? And I think we'd be especially interested in your thoughts on works that might offer an alternative to commercial technology or resist ways or resist that technology in ways that might bring about critical or curatorial or creative or social benefits. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. I think for this one, I wonder if I'm going to just quickly share my screen. Can you see that? You're able to see my screen? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to bring this in because I'm actually just completing this project together with Joana Varon from Coding Rights, which is a Brazilian hacker feminist organization, and together um, with sorry, let me pull this up. So together with Joana Varon, Mari Tamari, Berhan Tai, who's there in the audience, I believe. Hey, Berhan. And Vanessa Coates. We're just completing this project called AI Commons, Nourishing Alternatives to Big Tech Monoculture. And I'm not going to share the entire work. It will be available pretty soon, but I wanted to just kind of give you a little bit of a preview. Again, this is not quite published yet. It'll be coming out shortly, but this is our attempt to, to kind of develop a response to this question, the question that's on many of our minds these days, which is what might we do in the face of this ever-growing corporate mega hype bubble around so-called artificial intelligence and all of the harms that are happening in that space. This is us exploring this question of whether there might be a way to imagine a commons-based approach to the development of so-called artificial intelligence. And kind of what we did is we did a bit of a field scan. So we wanted to see, who is out there thinking about this question and taking action to try and develop a different type of ecosystem of technological development that's not simply the largest tech companies in the world dominating the space with a sort of monocultural, largest model possible that can do everything approaches. And I think, what we did is we identified a couple hundred organizations that we think might be part of an emerging AI Commons ecosystem. And then we talk about that in this project. Before there's really just one slide I want to show you, but before diving into it, I would say, our framing is really that there needs to be a radical transformation of the entire sector if there's going to be anything that looks like an AI Commons and that doesn't reproduce the harms of the current AI development pipeline. We want to think about, what is AI through a decolonial lens, a transfeminist lens, an anti-racist lens, indigenous, decentralized, post-capitalist, ecologically sustainable, commons-based. Because the way that it's currently being developed, the set of tools that we call AI are primarily being used to advance the matrix of domination or capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy and settler colonialism. And, I'm going to skip a lot of the framing, but basically this is the context that most so-called AI systems are being developed in right now. Techno-solutionist, monopolist, no care for environmental damage, energy use, water use, no care for the social harms that are happening in terms of increasingly automated inequality, no care for the reproduction of surveillance capitalism and data colonialism. Everything is being framed in terms of an AI arms race, both between the largest firms and between nation states that are using sort of military reference points to insist that it's important to advance headlong towards the automation of everything. I think the most horrible example that we could talk about right now is what's happening in Palestine, where the Israeli government and the IDF have developed a whole set of so-called AI tools to help automate a genocide. Everything from Lavender, which is their name for a kill list automation system that pulls from, WhatsApp group membership and email membership and pulls from social media and pulls from cell phone location data to assign a probability to Palestinians in Gaza that they should be eligible to be added to a kill list for targeted assassination and that system is called Lavender, or the system called the Gospel, which is similar, but it's a building nomination, tool that flags what they call high value targets for for airstrikes and drone strikes, to the tool called Where's Daddy, which which takes people from the kill list and decides to conduct helps military so-called intelligence conduct strikes when the person targeted for assassination has just returned to their family home, with the intent being to kill as many members of the family as possible to reduce the likelihood of future retribution from family members, and a number of other horrible systems that they have developed to help automate the genocide that they're conducting. And of course, we can't take the information that we learn about these systems comes from investigative reporting and comes from sources inside the Israeli military. We should also understand that part of that is propaganda efforts. So it's sort of a useful story for them to be able to tell, to say, no, we're not completely indiscriminately targeting people. They had a certain probability, of being a valid military target, and so we should reject that because, of course, what's happening is, clearly far beyond careful targeting of military targets. There are tens of thousands of confirmed civilian casualties, more than 20,000 of them children, and so on and so forth. So part of this is also propaganda to help them sell these systems to other nation states. But so that's a sort of extreme of the AI systems that are being developed under this context. So we would have a lot of work to do to get to a different context where we would foster a fully alternative ecosystem where we might develop AI based on a commons infrastructure, decolonial AI, post-capitalist AI, transfeminist, just, sustainable in environmental terms, and so on and so forth. So what I really wanted to show, though, was just, let me pop down to this particular slide. So I want to show this because you can get into more detail in the report itself when it actually drops. But sorry, I can't tell whether are you able to see the whole graphic, or is part of it being blocked?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can see it ends at potential allies for an AI Commons pipeline. If there's nothing below that, we can see everything.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so what we have is on the left, we have an image that compares sort of traditional mining and mineral extraction with the current process of producing AI systems. So, where you have smelters and refiners, you have data cleaners and collectors, where you have manufacturing processes, you have data validation, where you have assemblers, you have model training, and so on and so forth. So the different sort of steps in big tech AI production, which is all about let's gather as much data as we possibly can through any means possible. The data is gathered in ways that are not consented and not remunerated. You put as much as you can in, and you train a general purpose model that takes huge amounts of energy. You clean the data using outsourced, low-paid labor under terrible conditions. And I think that later in the week, Berhan's going to talk a little bit about some work that she's done with Kenyan workers who are involved in that, but talking about some of the sort of autonomy and resistance practices that they're, the data workers are also showing. Then you deploy your models in all types of environments, and it's a one-size-fits-all model. It's not fit for purpose, so it performs kind of poorly. It hallucinates a lot. It produces, text and images that don't actually respond that well to the context that you're supposed to be using it for. It only performs well in major world languages, and so on and so forth. It reproduces stereotypes, both in text and image. If you use it for automated decision making, it will tend to reproduce white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, cisnormativity, and so on, because you've thrown the largest possible data set at it, which is going to be overwhelmingly over-indexed upon global minority populations. So, wealthy, white, Western, cisgender, male, so on and so forth. So against that production process, in this report, we're imagining what might it take to produce an AI commons ecosystem where, the data layer itself, rather than throwing everything that you can and gathering as much data as possible in unconsented ways, you would carefully curate a data set. You would allow data sovereignty to be maintained. Local communities or networked communities would retain control of their data and would meaningfully consent and opt in to have their data used to train a model. The model would be specific and fit for purpose. Instead of doing one size fits all, you would say, no, we were going to build a model to perform a specific task in a specific context as well as possible, using data that's consented, where the workers who are involved in cleaning the data and in tuning the outputs to be better and more appropriate for the particular purpose would be well-paid workers under good conditions. Maybe they'd be members of a data workers cooperative. Maybe they'd be unionized workers. They would have, decent conditions. And if part of their work involved flagging harmful content, they would be well supported with psychological support and everything that they needed, so that difficult and harmful psychological work would be well compensated and they would be cared for during the process. The infrastructure upon which this AI Commons would be run would be shared infrastructure with free, libre, and open source software that would be installable by anyone in decentralized and federated processes. And of course, since it would all be free and open source and the data set would be known and available, it would also be auditable by third parties who were not only contractors for major tech firms, but by investigative reporters and by state agencies and by nonprofit organizations and others who have an interest in ensuring that systems are less biased and harmful. So there would be meaningful community oversight of these systems. And there would also, of course, be the capacity for communities to decide whether or not this particular AI system should exist at all, rather than the constant assumption that we've got to build it first and faster before someone else builds it and deploys it against us. Instead, there would be both cultural norms and social processes and also significant and meaningful regulatory oversight at different levels, whether that be at the municipal, state, and national level, and also through transnational agreements, where there would be meaningful processes that would allow people to say, yeah, we really don't think that anybody should build kill list automation systems at all. It should be banned, and there should be significant sanctions against any firm or nation state that works on such technology. And so that's what we're imagining. And then we set out to see who's building pieces of an AI Commons ecosystem already. And we found 234 entities and we mapped them in different ways. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there and just give you a little bit of a preview. We found various potential allies for an AI commons pipeline of the type that we're imagining. We think that there are meaningful communities of technology developers and data practitioners who are already doing some pieces of this work. So people from the free, libre, and open source software movement, from the data and platform co-op sector, from the open science community. There are also a number of people trying to develop decolonial imaginaries and practices around AI systems, including, feminist and decolonial AI, thinkers and hackers and producers, people from the disability justice community. And then in the governance space, there's a number of digital rights organizations, legal organizations, and regulatory bodies and agencies and independent auditors who are all kind of working to try and develop more meaningful AI governance. And also in the labor sector, as I mentioned before, there are people who are doing the invisibilized work of data cleaning and AI systems production who are already working on unionizing and in some cases creating, trying to create cooperatives and stand them up. So we think that, there is some hope out there. There's a lot that would have to change for us to shift from our current, system to a more commons-based system, but we have to try and imagine it and promote it together. We're going to end up with more of the same.
I'm sure that all of the audience is as eagerly awaiting the publication of that report as I am. That's super exciting. Thanks for putting that together. I think you hinted in your summary of that that, like you said, a lot has to change, and community accountability in particular is always a challenge for living up to design justice ideals. What advice do you offer, the people in the audience here embarking on design justice AI projects to make sure their work and their outcomes are accountable to the communities they serve? And, we're particularly interested in how the issues might change when designers are using AI methods and tools.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that it's easy to talk about community accountability in the abstract. And I think it's more difficult to do in practice. But I think that there are a number of specific tools and processes that are really, really helpful, and maybe they're not that exciting, but they really do help. So, for example, in my own work, and also when I teach, design justice and to students. So for about 8 years, I taught a community-led design lab while I was at MIT. I'm no longer there for various reasons, largely because they're a transphobic trash institution. But while I was there, when I was teaching the co-design studio, one of the key things that the students would learn how to do is actually develop an MOU, a memo of understanding, a written document with a community partner that they were designing with. And I have a template for the MOU, but it's really, it can be anything that you need it to be, but it just describes at the beginning, what is the project, who are the people who are involved, what's the meeting cadence going to look like, what are the goals that everybody has, what are the resources that each party is sort of bringing to the table. And resources doesn't just mean, money. It means, time, energy, money, space. What are you bringing to the table? And the MOU also kind of spells out, what's going to happen with some of the key outputs of the process. So, for example, you want to clarify, you know, who's going to kind of be the owner of whatever the output is? Is this something that you're going to own together? Everybody who works on it will have sort of shared ownership. Is it a situation that's more like the community-based organization is going to be the owner, and so you're just kind of, if you're not part of that community-based organization, but you're working with them as a designer or developer or technologist or whatever skill set you're bringing to the table, is it more like a client relationship where you're doing work for them, which they will then kind of own and maintain in the future? If there's any revenue that's going to be produced by this thing you're doing together, where is it going to go? Who gets to decide what happens with this thing in the future? So you could call that governance stake. So will this, is there going to be a community board that will govern this thing and own it in the future? Is it just going to be, will it belong to, whatever the structure of the community-based organization or the community partner? Is it a multi-organization partnership, in which case, you might want to say, well, it's going to be, the governance will be 30%, 30%, 30% between the different organizations who were involved in developing it. You also might want to put in a clause about the story of the project. So for example, in academic spaces, there's an unfortunate tendency for well-meaning academics to, work with a community partner, and then you produce a paper or a project or whatever the case may be. You take it and then you present it back to, in academic spaces, at conferences, in academic journals, whatever the case may be, but in language that's not that accessible to the community that you worked with, and in a venue that might not be, it might be paywalled, or if it's an academic conference, it might be expensive or it might be far away. And the community never really gets to see what you produced. So you can also commit at the beginning of the project to share back with the community partner whatever outputs you are going to produce from it, and to do so in language that's accessible. Another thing that you can do that I think is really valuable is let's say that you do a co-design project or a design justice project with a community partner. You could also commit and say, if I'm invited to present the findings anywhere, I'll invite you to come with me and we'll present it together. So that's another way of sort of sharing authorship and ownership and narrative and visibility. So again, these things may, I don't know, they're very kind of nuts and bolts, but I think that that's actually what it really comes down to. So, community accountability can be very hand wavy if you don't talk through and think through and develop clear shared understanding between the different folks involved in a design process, around what's going to happen with all of the outputs in the kinds of ways that I've just described. And I also, later when we get into the conversation, would always love to hear, what strategies people, come up with, or examples that they have of community accountability in design processes. And with AI in particular, I think if you refer back to the sort of the AI Commons framework that we just presented, there's a number of ways that we could think about what community accountability needs to look like. One is, of course, in the data that you're using to train a model. So first of all, is there strong consent in the use of the data? And by strong consent, of course, we're not talking about click-through consent, which is a bunch of multiple pages of legal text that nobody reads or understands, and they're sort of forced to click through. We're talking about like the consentful tech model that Unilee developed together with others, which you can find at consentfultech.io. This is sort of drawing from the idea of consent and strong consent culture in sex, and thinking about what it means for data. So you could think about the fries model of consent, FRIES, which is that consent should be freely given, revocable, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And if it's not fries, it's not good consent. And so you would think about how community accountable AI systems might be developed through data that was shared in a strongly consentful manner by a community. The consent was freely given, it was revocable. So said, well, if we don't actually like the tool or the system that you build with our, I don't know, our language data set that we decided to share with you, if you don't do a good job with it, we're going to revoke our consent and you'll have to shut down, the project. Informed because people would know exactly what you were planning to do with it. Enthusiastic because people would really be excited about the project rather than just, well, I guess you can do this. And specific because it would be, we're going to, I don't know, we're going to train this model specifically to do translation, for example. And if you decided to do something else with it, like generation of new texts, that would require a new process to discuss with the community. So we built this effective translation tool. Do you think we should also extend it to be able to do, text generation? And people would then discuss and say, maybe they'd say, sure, that sounds like fun. Or maybe they'd say, no, we gave you permission to use this data to do translation, but we don't really want to, generate new text in our language with it. We don't think that that's a useful tool. So let's not do that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the way you're describing how a whole range of frameworks, I guess, that can often just be used to maintain existing power structures like memorandums of agreement and publishing hierarchies and that sort of stuff can be redesigned to actually enable a just approach. In a way, you've sort of a little bit addressed the question I was going to ask insofar as you've talked about the type of AI that we should have that wouldn't actually necessitate this question I'm about to ask. So I'll ask it anyway, taking us from the AI we should imagine to the AI we have. And so my question has to do with the way that there's quite a contrast in the scale and uniformity of commercial tech solutions and the heterogeneous pluriverse of organically emerging, diverse community-led practices. And I wonder, what are your thoughts, perhaps through a design justice lens, about reconciling the need for scale, what these companies actually are claiming is the need for scale. Maybe that's what you'll disagree with, but certainly the current scale of AI systems with sensitivity to local needs and the need for robust regulation. How do the scales work?
Yeah. Well, I think you intuited part of my answer to the question, which is that the companies are telling us that we need a lot of scale and speed. And I think that we need to question everything that they say. So the need for massive scale, is it a need? Or is it an artifact of the current paradigm of let's build one size fits all general purpose models that we think should be able to do everything? Is that approach the right approach? There's a small but growing community of scientists in the space who are talking about how that basic assumption is the wrong assumption. Timnit Gebru and her collaborators have recently published some papers about how in language, large language models that can supposedly do everything don't perform as well as fit for purpose models that specifically focus on smaller and marginalized, languages. So rather than say, we just throw enough data at it, um, and enough compute, and enough water and enough power, then we'll magically, without really understanding how, arrive at systems that can do every language. You could say, well, how about you just like, why don't we say, let's build systems that are designed to do the specific thing that we want to do. And if we want to include a language that's a smaller language, or a language that's been marginalized, or then let's just focus on gathering and developing a very high quality data set in that language, and let's develop a fit for purpose model. It'll use a lot less data, a lot less compute, a lot less energy. The data can be gathered in ways that are more consensual, and we can actually develop tools that will perform better than the general purpose models. And that principle could be applied over and over and over again. And instead of having 3 companies that use massive amounts of public funding, massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of water, massive amounts of compute to develop systems that, yeah, they perform, I guess, well on certain things, but once you dive into any particular domain, area, or context, or specific type of task, you realize that they don't actually perform that well. We could be developing systems that are really fit for purpose, and they don't have to be, at giant scale. And they still may take a lot of compute and, and energy and so forth, but the orders of magnitude less. And that approach would also enable us to make more intentional decisions about the types of tasks that we're training models for, and the types of problems that we actually want to solve with them, and making sure that they do those things well and in ways that are less harmful. Whereas the current approach, we already know the harms that are being produced, and we're just allowing these companies to go ahead and do it anyway. More than allowing, we're funding them to do it with massive amounts of public money and massive subsidy, if you include the energy and environmental costs as well. So I think first we need to question the assumption that the massive scale one-size-fits-all approach is the approach that we want and should be pursuing as a society. I think that it's a real question. So yeah, if we want a heterogeneous pluriverse, I don't think it will just organically emerge. So like in the project that we just did, the Commons AI ecosystem, yes, there is certainly there are traces of such a sort of networked heterogeneous community of developers and imaginaries certainly emerging, but it's quite around the edges, and there's no way that that approach can compete with the current massively publicly subsidized, approach of the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. So there will have to be a massive multi-pronged effort to shift the AI development paradigm if we want to shift it. And that would include a huge redirection of public funds. It would include a massive shift in regulatory power from public agencies. It would include a reorientation of, education that would also reorient people's desire in the space around, for students, for example, after they graduate with their computer science degree, are they trying to go land a gig at one of the largest shops, or are they trying to move into public sector or nonprofit or distributed free and open source AI Commons ecosystem? So a lot of things will have to shift culturally as well, for us to get there. And I don't think that shift is something that could happen sort of independently of a broader set of shifts that need to happen. So, you could sum this up maybe with, there's no just AI under capitalism. right, under racial capitalism. So we need broader systems transformation that will touch all sectors of life and all aspects of what we're doing as a species on this planet. And within that broader shift, the production of fit for purpose statistical tools that take advantage of some of the techniques that that we fit under that umbrella of AI, machine learning, computer vision, natural language processing, automated decision systems of different kinds. We might choose to develop them or not in order to fit the needs of a post-capitalist, anti-racist, decolonized world.
I'm going to put on my moderator hat here for a moment. We're 1 hour in. So we do have a couple more questions prepared, but maybe we can turn things over to the audience. And
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's see, do we have any questions that people would like to pose? Because like Matthew said, we have a couple of others, but does anyone want to ask something?
Yeah, thanks for that great presentation and talk. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned in the Fright's principle, R is revocability. So how do you revoke consent in a super large language model when, like a particular information has already been inputted, and then, with the concept of anonymization, it's difficult to trace it back and remove it. But also when there are multiple committee members who are involved, and perhaps, one or two might not want to, but the rest potentially might still want to proceed. So to what extent could we really apply that principle in large data AI? Thank you.
Yeah, so certainly the way that we have currently developed the set of systems that we're calling AI, revocability is not possible. We haven't built the instrumentation or the tooling to make it possible. I think that it's an open question. If we decided that revocability was an important property of the systems that we're building, then there's about whether we would be able to develop such instrumentation, and possibly we'd be able to solve that, possibly we wouldn't, but certainly very few people are working on it right now, so it's not going to happen on its own. In terms of the other part of your question, which is, what happens when so you gathered a data set from a community, and some community members want to revoke access and others don't. Well, I think that would be a question about the types of agreements that we would need to normalize in producing a different type of AI ecosystem, the commons-based AI ecosystem that we we're talking about before. So perhaps we would develop strong social and legal processes and mechanisms by which communities could make decisions together, which we would then respect around data use. Possibly, if we spent time and energy on it, we would find ways to make it possible to remove individuals or small or subgroups of people's data if they decided they wanted to revoke consent. Whereas, of course, currently we haven't developed any of the social, legal, cultural, or technical infrastructure or tooling to enable any of that. So again, this would require a shift in the entire production process and would require new tooling and new techniques. That's a little bit of an abstract answer, but I think that it's really true. What you could, a place to bring it down to earth a little bit that we are seeing right now is a number of lawsuits from copyright industry actors where this is happening both in visual arts as well as in music, where copyright holders are going to AI model developers and saying, we can clearly demonstrate that this generative AI output is extremely similar, or quoting at length, visually, textually, or through audio, um, you know, works that are that we hold copyright to, that were clearly used without permission. And you can do side-by-side comparison, and you can see, this auto-generated song is 95% similar to this other work here. And so it's clearly highly influential in in the model and in the output. This was done without permission, so you're being sued, and you're going to have to shut down the whole model and retrain it without our works, which you didn't ask permission for. We could get into a longer conversation about copyright itself as a tool and as a mechanism, but there are now multiple real-world examples of legal action where companies that have basically used works without consent are experiencing a little bit of a fuck around and find out moment, where we'll see what the courts say about whether this is actually transformative use or not. And there are some cases that are coming through that on both sides. But I think what's going to happen is they're going to be forced to the table to, at the very least, negotiate a revenue share, if not go even further in the way that the fast and free approach to scraping everything, including it in your training set, might be on its way out, depending on what the legal precedents are over the next year or two.
Question up the back.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha, for what has been very insightful on many levels. I hope we have time for a little story, because it acts as the prefix to the question. So back in 2020, we had this protest, the End SARS movement, where Nigerians gathered to protest police brutality engineered by a group of people. It's like a government parastatal called the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Am I getting it right now? Yeah. So that's the name. And then the youths were all out in the street protesting this, demanding justice, and also policy change and all that. And in order to signal the strength of the movement, a lot of designs and graphic work was brought on. You'll find all over Twitter people designing stuff. And then one person, her name is Ire Aderinoku. She designed this thing, what later came to be the End SARS logo. So it's like a yellow background with a Black Power symbol on it. And everyone went off on R. It's like, oh, why would you put a Black Power logo? That's like a copyright thing. That is right in the middle of a movement that is supposed to be united and supposed to act as a front towards the government. And it became this, there was this divisiveness going on, where she became, I don't want to say victim of cyberbullying. That's not to victimize her, but she became very, she became an object that people could pass around and talk. So as much as we could go on regarding copyright issues, as much as that leads us to copyright issues, should she have used the Black Power thing, one thing that is very noticeable is that the pushback she got for using Black Power for End SARS police brutality movement is somewhat a signal of anti-feminist agenda. She identified with a group of people called the Feminist Coalition, and these were the people that were the administrative backbone of the protests. And people already had their qualms with them, especially because some members of the coalition started prioritizing other sections of the community in their in their own protest. So you hear things like queer lives matter, da da da, and everyone's like, no, this is about the youths. Why should you say queer lives matter? So it all adds all this divisive rhetoric within it. So I want you to speak to this notion of the community self-censoring itself, almost as if in its pursuit of design justice, like there were lots and lots of designs and graphic work, but the pushback was against this one just because of the other symbols that surround it. So how was that? What does that mean for community-oriented design justice, and how can that be solved? This sort of self-censoring that almost as if the community is its own enemy, even when it comes to movements and design justice.
Thanks for sharing that story. And yeah, that's you got right to the most difficult of all the questions, right? Which is the word community does a lot of work when we talk about community-led processes, because every community contains many communities, and there's often beef between them. So community is beef all the way down. So I think, we can't assume that a so-called community space means that everything is nice and ideal and conflict-free. There's always conflict within the community, and there's levels of marginalization within the matrix of domination of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and settler colonialism, and disability, and migration status. There are always going to be people, on the margins of the margins of the margins, and there's going to be conflict internally. And so we can't just wave our hand and say, it's a community-led process, it's going to be fine. So we have to talk about how, the matrix of domination has to be undone. And that includes within community as well as between communities and between communities and institutions and the nation state and so on and so forth. And it never will be perfect, and always there will be internal conversation and conflict and challenges and pressures. And I think that here's a place where, we're starting to move from talking about design and design justice, and now we're just talking more broadly about the process of the struggle for liberation, which is an eternal struggle, and liberation is a horizon of possibility that we want to try and move towards, and we want to try and gather as many people as possible to move with us together towards that horizon of liberation. And along the way, there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be beef, and there's going to be attempts to hold one another accountable internally. And some of those accountability attempts will come from places of love and a desire for true shared transformation, and some of them won't come from that place. And it can be really hard to know, which is which. So I think, yeah, you've done a great job of surfacing this tension and this dynamic. And, you're talking about there's a design language that's being developed by an active movement with, life or death stakes, and people start backbiting and internally fighting and critiquing and leveraging one debate, which is a copyright debate, but it sounds like in service of an anti-feminist critique or an attempt to silence or marginalize, queer voices within, a broad-based movement. And this is not something that I think can be sort of solved within the neat bucket of a design process. This is something that is solved in the streets and the meeting spaces and the community processes of building powerful liberatory social movements that where we learn how to move together and hold one another accountable and keep pushing so that all of us can be free against the necro-political attacks of the state and the globalized capitalist system that's trying to replace all of us with a corporate globalized monoculture. And if you try and deviate from that, then you're subject to police repression and military attack and automated surveillance and targeting and all of those things. So I don't really have an answer there. I just appreciate the question. And I think it's part of like a broader, liberation struggle. And I think that we also can't be paralyzed by trying to do, or what's the word? We can't try so hard to have the perfect process, the perfect community process in a world that's imperfect, where community has challenges and internal struggles. We shouldn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We also have to do work. We want to make designs. We want to make systems. We want to write code. We want to play music. We want to do whatever type of creative practice or socio-technical practice that we're into, produce work and share it with the world and put it out there. And then if it produces controversy and critique, then the best we can do is try and respond and try and differentiate is this critique valid? And oh, I messed up here. Well, then let me try and do this better next time. Or is this, coming from a place of really just trying to tear me and my community down for some other reason, in which case I can ignore and move on and be unbothered, or I can address it, head on and use the moment as a moment for education.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for these answers and for your time. I've been thinking recently about the relationship between participation and abolition, which I think is becoming increasingly relevant, especially when it comes to generative AI. And some colleagues of mine at the University of Edinburgh argue that abolition is an instance of participation, which I think is an interesting but perhaps debatable perspective. And however, in relation to AI, ML technologies, and especially generative AI, I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on the relationship between participation and abolition, and specifically about sort of where we draw the line, where we decide to engage or disengage with technology. And what does this mean for the design justice framework? This is my question. Thank you.
Excuse me. Well, one second. Apologies for that. I muted myself to cough and I couldn't unmute myself. Oh, this is a great question as well. I think that I'll be honest with you. Right now, the automated decision systems that I see and hear and feel and understand are doing the most harm to communities. So carceral systems. This is surveillance systems, border control, shot spotter, crime heat maps, automated policing systems, and then the systems, the necro-political systems, necro-technological systems, of course, following Achille Mbé's idea of the necropolitical of the nation state, and its supporting institutions having the power of life and death and the power to maim and the power to control bodies, sort of algorithmic necropolitics being expressed most vividly in what's happening in Gaza and the genocide there. So military systems of automated assassination, selection, these types of carceral and military necro-technological systems are the systems that I hear communities, Black and brown communities, communities, queer and trans communities, those that are most migrant communities, those that are most harmed by carceral technology, are focused on the abolition of these types of automated decision systems, and in some cases with some success. So I believe it's Los Angeles, or no, Chicago. In Chicago, they successfully organized a campaign to stop the deployment of a shot spotter system, which is an audio surveillance system that claims to be able to pinpoint the location of gunshots and then automatically deploy police, but it's been demonstrated to both commit a number of errors and inappropriately flag even individuals for targeted arrest who weren't involved in in gun violence. And then there's just the fact of these systems are deployed only in working class Black and Latino and Arab neighborhoods. So there's this question around, wherever you deploy more surveillance systems, of course, you will then make more visible criminalized activity, which will then justify the increased deployment of policing and carceral processes, which then will have harmful impacts on communities. So, in fact, there was just last weekend, there was a conference in Chicago called Take Back Tech that was organized by Media Justice and Mi Gente, who've done incredible work, both exposing carceral technology systems and also organizing base building community-led campaigns to stop their deployment or roll back their deployment in some cases. When I think about technology and abolition, that's where my mind goes first, is looking at like what active social movements are currently doing to block and roll back the deployment of surveillance, policing, military, and other types of carceral technology. And so I think that we should focus on that and support those types of campaigns, because these are where the most severe harms are happening on a daily basis. And so, in the city of Detroit, you've now got multiple incidents where Black people have been falsely flagged by facial recognition surveillance systems as people who've committed, who've engaged in criminalized activity. The system can't, there's accuracy disparity on darker skinned faces, and so people get wrongfully flagged, and then police show up at their door, as happened with Robert Johnson and with others. His story was in the New York Times, but it's happening on a regular basis now that people are being falsely flagged and arrested based on the deployment of these socio-technical systems that exhibit racial bias. So we have to ban them and abolish them and roll them back. And there's been a fair amount of success at the municipal level in the United States of people organizing campaigns to block the deployment of facial recognition systems deployed for policing. I think after, learning about what's been happening in Gaza, I think we are at a moment where there needs to be a massive worldwide campaign to ban permanently the use of automated decision systems in warfare, in target selection, and in automated target acquisition stuff. We really have to fight hard to stop it. course, I'm not answering your question, so then, because that's where I'm sort of preoccupied by this area. When we think about generative AI, certainly there are harms happening. Um, and so um, the set of harms that I think about when I think about generative AI, so one would be the ecological harms that are happening just from the sheer energy costs and water costs and compute costs of developing and training the models, and then the production of the new outputs is quite energy intensive. So that's something that we need to organize around. Um, then you could talk about the ways that generative AI does representational harm. So of course, it's quite easy to produce images that reproduce stereotypes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that reproduce sexualized and racialized tropes, that reproduce images of social power position that are based on the generalized set of images that are available on the net, which don't represent um, the planetary population either as it is and certainly not as we'd like it to be. We could also talk about the production of disinformation, um, propaganda, intentional misinformation, and the way that these generative AI systems are being used to amplify that work. And we could also talk about sort of jobs and job loss and the ways that people who produce certain types of writing and imagery and audio are being, their jobs are being replaced by generative AI systems. And that's not an abstract fear, it's a real thing that's happening. And there's now an increasing number of news stories in particular that are coming out around the way that different industries are automating, jobs out of existence, and that's having a harmful impact on certain sectors. So under those conditions, I think that there's a number of different sub-communities that are calling for boycott and abolition of various types of generative AI tools. There's certainly many artists, visual artists, who are demanding that people not use these tools. There's an increasing number of musicians who are asking for this. There are people who are involved in sort of copywriting, work that are calling on folks to not use these tools. And I think that those calls are important and valid and interesting. And each of us have to decide the degree to which we want to support them, make personal decisions around not participating in the use of generative AI tools based on everything we know about how they work. But also, of course, individual action isn't a substitute for either mass mobilization or institutional shifts. And so part of the big challenge is that there's lots of powerful institutions that are currently in the process of incorporating generative AI tools into their workflow. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to undo. And so I think that the AI Commons proposal that we're, with Bernard and Joanna and others that we're trying to advance is a way to think about how we might, if there's a way to imagine generative AI tools as useful augmentations of creative processes of various kinds, I think it would require that the production process of those tools would have to shift in these important ways. So maybe we want to put energy towards building that AI Commons ecosystem, or maybe we don't think there's any good use of the generative AI tools, in which case we could take a harder lined, abolitionist approach.
Is this working? Hi. Thanks so much. I really, really appreciate your focus on process throughout this. And I wanted to go back a little bit to the design justice process and ask, when it comes to accountability, I love an MOU. You develop the MOU. What happens when someone doesn't hold up their end of the MOU? And have you built in, with your students or in your own work, transformative justice processes or anything like that to kind of counter the risk of a broken MOU?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that a good MOU at the beginning will include, some type of clause that's about, if this isn't working, here's what we're going to do. Ideally, you try and like talk it through with the various parties involved before anything else. And then if that doesn't work, maybe you can agree beforehand a third party mediator of some kind who's trusted, who you could bring in, to help you mediate what needs to happen next. I think those are really good things to build in, at the start, so that you don't want to be in a moment of conflict and then trying to figure out how can we agree on like who could help us mediate. You want to think about that beforehand. And in the template MOUs that I share with students or that I use in my own, process, it does typically include a clause like that. Like if we can't work it out, then here's a person or an organization that we would work with to try and figure it out. Of course, it's possible that none of that will work and the thing will collapse. And that's reality. That's moving from, the abstraction of like, how can we set ourselves up for as much success as possible? And then dealing with the reality that sometimes things don't work out and there will be conflict. And hopefully people will show up in a way that's about getting a good outcome that everyone feels okay about, but it's not always possible. That's just real.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here. This is Lauren asking the question. So earlier, you were talking about the issues that face the sort of chicken and egg question of the larger ecosystem that favors justice emerging and the incremental tools and approaches and movement building that occur, including potentially the use of copyright in the courts, which is now, for many people exciting, but for others not so much. So I just by accident have ended up working with a group of musicians. They are not of the famous tier that signed the recent musician level, but they're pretty famous and elite within the musician community because, among other things, they are unionized musicians in a New York area local of the larger union. And they have been miserable to find that that the union itself, the larger union, has gotten some kind of consultant who is giving them a sort of somewhat hyped story about how this could be a great thing for musicians, and it doesn't pass their sniff test at all. So, I'm sure you've heard many stories of unions having, disagreements between locals, rank and file, and the leadership. That's not where the question is. But the question is about mobilization and, how you think, what they're facing, quite frankly, is that a lot of their members just simply have no idea what this thing is. And that is a sort of a common problem that you're dealing with people who are being affected and are being asked to mobilize in resistance, but at the same time are digesting, mainstream media narratives about inevitability, or even, sort of sci-fi movie versions of what AI actually is, and that either being the real threat or the real promise, and all other kinds of things in between that just make it so hard to send out a message if you want to sort of like build a movement within your union and outside of it, because these particular individuals are in no way uninterested in independent musicians. They would love to reach them. And, I'm just sort of curious if you have ideas for how to reach out in a case like that, what resources there are to sort of both educate and mobilize at the same time within an affected community. And also if you have any concerns that, one message that is being contemplated is to do with they're actually being glad that the new music models, Udio and I forget the other one's name, Luna, Suno. There's so many things out there now. I think it's Suno and Udio that are being sued by the labels. And these musicians are under no, they are well aware that the label is not always their friend. They've all been impacted by streaming. And on the other hand, they genuinely believe that the labels have what is necessary to get, throw sand in the gears of these companies that are now marketing these models, if not actually to force them to retract them. And, I guess the question then becomes, what is the message to people? And this includes some of the musician community who have thought of copyright as, not the hill that they want to die on, and really wish that the commons were there and ready to invest in.
Yeah. So a number of questions in there. So I guess I would say first that we are at a very interesting moment where we've got a number of different sort of actors in the room with some overlapping and some conflicting interests, and then a story about whose interests are being served by whom. So you've got the union, the labels, the artists themselves, the companies producing the generative music models. And so, and then you've got some like mechanisms and tools. You've got the legal instrument of copyright, which is one mechanism to try and rein in, what the model developers are doing. So that's a really complicated puzzle. I think for me, my first instinct would always be to say, okay, how do we think about, the interests of the working musicians first at the center? But then, of course, the working musicians are divided. Some people see an opportunity, right? And so this is, well, if I'm a highly visible musician and my sound is known, say my voice is known, then there is a real opportunity here to work with the company to train a model, and then the fans can, have my voice saying different things, and I can get paid for it. So first, I would say we have to take seriously the interests and desires of the different actors. We shouldn't start from like an ideological position of like, quote unquote, AI is bad and we must stop it, because first of all, AI is not a thing. AI is a marketing term. So what we're talking about here is, companies using databases full of recorded sound to produce models that could output sound files. And then we want to talk about, like, is there a use for this that might be good? Are the energy costs worth it? Is this something that could be of benefit? And the fans, of course, are another sort of interested party here that has real desires and I don't know needs, but have an interest in what happens. So yeah, is there a world where there's some software tools that can produce audio files that could be useful tools for the creative composition process of the musicians, or could be useful things for the fans who enjoy the styles of particular artists? And could it be done in a way that was, consentful and balanced the needs of various stakeholders? To me, the answer is maybe. I don't know. But certainly what's happening now, which is just, company hires some engineers, scrapes data set without consent, produces the model, and then tries to find a business use for it. It's not one it's not ethical, it's not just, it's not set up to support the interests of um, anyone other than the company. And so we're in a battleground right now. The labels, what they will probably try and focus on is forcing the companies that produce the models to do revenue share with them. And then presumably some small portion of that revenue share might trickle down to some of the musicians. I personally don't think that's a super great outcome, mostly because we've seen, the ones who will benefit most under that arrangement, it's, the companies first, the AI model companies, and then the labels will get a cut. And the artists, it would probably only end up being a tiny portion of the artists who are most visible and whose sounds are used and referenced most frequently, who would get a meaningful cut. And that's similar to what we've seen in streaming. And it's not really a great, model for the artists. So I think we should resist that one. I think if there are, again, referring back to the AI Commons model, you would say, okay, is there some group of artists who would opt in to, with enthusiastic consent, use their catalog to train fit for purpose tools to do specific things that fans might like and that might augment their income stream? That might be possible. It might be possible to do, and it's most likely to happen if the artists themselves are at the table through the design process, thinking about like, yeah, I'd love a tool that does this. Or I'll give you another example. I produce electronic music for fun. I enjoy doing it. And recently, one of the things that's happened in the sort of music production space is that we've got increasingly good software models that can split tracks in recorded songs down into their component, elements. It's called the stems of tracks. And so you could take like just a recording of, of a band that you like or a song that you love, and the software can automatically identify the drums, the bass, the piano, the organ, the vocals, and to split them out into separate tracks. And this is really useful if you're an electronic music producer, because then you can use the isolated audio elements and sample them and rework them and turn them into new elements in a transformative work where you're following both the cultural norms and legal requirements of transformative music production, and using a small piece of a drum break, and turning that into a new beat, that type of thing. This is really exciting. And so there are sophisticated algorithms that are involved. They were trained upon, I actually haven't researched the data sets that were used to train the automated separation stuff. Probably wasn't done in super great consensual ways, but it's produced a tool that's quite useful for a certain type of creative production process. In that case, I think the tool has been developed to do something really useful because it's produced by people who work really closely with electronic music producers. So it's not exactly a design justice process in certain ways, but there is a fit for purpose specific tool that has been made to do a very specific type of thing. And And I think that that's really qualitatively different than saying, we're just going to produce a model where we throw a massive catalog of music at it, and then it can just produce entirely new songs. So this is, I think that there are really valid and valuable potential uses of using statistical tools in the music production space. What's happening in the generative AI space is not that, by and large, though there are some companies that are trying to pitch that they're doing a much more narrowly tailored thing that might be useful to people's music production processes. But I think that ultimately what's important is to have artists at the table when we're thinking about designing these things, and when we're thinking about how revenue might be shared or split. And in terms of copyright, that's a whole nother conversation, but like, in the past, I would say my position was sort of I was an anti-intellectual monopoly maximalist. I believe that all sort of intellectual property, so-called, was theft, and we should fight vigorously against copyright and patents and trademarks, and all knowledge should be shared freely. But over time, that position, I've shifted that position for a number of reasons, in part because of the debates that happened at the World Intellectual Property Organization around traditional and indigenous knowledge. The problem is if everything is open and freely shared, then under capitalism, multinational firms appropriate traditional and indigenous knowledge and the outputs of creative processes, and then they find ways to commodify it and capture a large amount of benefits. And so we need mechanisms to ensure that that happens less. And unfortunately, right now, copyright, trademark, and patents are some of the only existing legal tools that we have to block capitalist appropriation of community knowledge production. I don't think that in the long run, those are the right tools, but they're the ones that we have right now. So I guess I currently strategically support the use of intellectual monopolies to resist capitalistic closure. But I think in the long run, we need to develop new mechanisms to ensure that people doing creative work can survive and be compensated, and community knowledge and cultural practices can be protected from non-consented exploitation. So we have to use the tools that we have, while we also have to try and envision and imagine, what would we like the legal regime to look like in the future? What mechanisms might we imagine that would, protect people who are often harmed by the cultural industries, but without capitulating to the capitalist idea of the privatization of knowledge and culture.
Hello. Thank you so much for your insights and your time and your talk. It's been really, really fantastic. I'm sorry to ask more questions. I'm sure you're quite tired. But one of the things I wanted to ask related to the design justice principles, and I just want to give some context to my question. So I'm involved in like the AI regulation space, in particular on the issue of the regulation of deepfakes, as like myself as a survivor and activist of non-consensual intimate deepfakes. And what I found in the campaigning and the work from survivors is that regulators, academia, NGO, those working on these issues don't actually value the community of survivors, don't value lived experience, don't value our voices or our input. And so what we're dealing with is, like, I guess, how do we get people to adopt these principles when they are, A, don't know about them, and B, don't want to, because they don't want our voices or they don't really value it. And the second question is, it takes a lot of energy and time and labor on the backs of survivors and community to fight for that inclusion in the process, to fight for their voice, when that labour, I feel like, could be used fighting for the work, because they're spending so much time trying to be involved. So what advice would you give to communities who are wanting to use these principles potentially? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And I think what you said really, really resonates. You know, we have so many institutions and political processes and regulatory processes and academic spaces that, like you said, don't really value the experience don't really value lived experience. And if they do, it's often very tokenizing, or it requires translation by an expert. So rather than just listening to someone who's literally experienced, you know, a particular type of harm, it can only be heard when there's an interview that's been summarized and translated, you know, by an academic or a professional knowledge worker. And that's really a problem. And that's something that, you know, design justice is in opposition to that and fights back against that. We have multiple design justice network principles that are about valuing lived experience, just like we value other types of experience. So, you know, scholarly experience is valid, but it's only one type of knowledge, and there's many types of knowledge. And we really want a pluriversal approach, a multi-epistemological approach, a diverse knowledge base that can draw from different types of experience, whether lived or acquired in other ways, to inform the policies that we propose and the systems that we build and all of that. So first, yeah, just to say that, like, absolutely every type of regulatory process should be shifting to include people with lived experience as key influencers in, you know, what's discussed and the proposals that are developed on the other side. In fact, people with lived experience of harm should be the most important and powerful voice in proposing ways to minimize or reduce or repair that harm. And if not, then what are we really doing? But we don't live in a world like that. So I think design justice is one very small part of a much larger, broader set of interlinked movements that all recognize that and are pushing to transform the systems that we inhabit and the institutions that we, you know, that influence our lives so much, to be more community accountable and to be more accountable to people with lived experience. And I don't think that we can make dramatic systems change in little silos. So like environmental justice over here, design justice over here, and you know, and so on and so forth. Like each movement kind of on its own. Our struggles are all interlinked, and we need to really figure out how do we build broad-based, interlinked movement networks that can transform the institutions that shape our lives, the power structures, the political processes, and make all of them more responsive to and accountable to people with lived experience. So 100% agree with you there.
So we're coming up on time, so this will be our last question.
Hi, Sasha. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is around something that you talk about in your book, which is the political economy of design. And the question is based on like the work that I've been doing, which is try to look at international organizations, particularly those that are focused on forced migration domain, And one of the things that I have been seeing is happening more and more frequent is that you have some tech NGOs that work very closely with this organization, for example, but some of them have begun to change their business logic, just changing from just being tech NGOs into something other than that. And also some of these NGOs are like open source, but you have some that are also like moving away from being open source to something other than that. And I was just thinking, given your, given the concept that you brought up in in your book, like how do you think about, or how does a design justice project navigate this sort of dynamics?
How do we navigate the dynamics of shifting business models?
Right, particularly like more broadly, like the political economy of design.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, under capitalism, the underlying incentives for most production processes, not all, but most, or all the privileged sectors of the economy, is profitability. And so that produces the type of AI systems that we have. We have heavy public subsidy for the highly scaled, one-size-fits-all, model production that's with all of the costs are externalized, or as much as possible is externalized, ecological costs, energy costs, water costs, the social harms of all of the labor production, the production process that's largely, outsourced, de-skilled, psychological harms to the workers, all of those things, under capitalism, the firms that are producing these giant models are all incentivized to get as much public money as they can, offload as many of the costs as they possibly can, hoard all of the revenues to the degree that they possibly can, scrape all of the data that they can without any consent or without any compensation. All of those things are the outcome of the political economy of neoliberal racial capitalism that's been globalized, and without transforming that, we will not be able to escape or transform the current big tech monoculture system of AI development and transform it into a AI commons, feminist, decentralized, free and open source, anti-racist, commons-based production process, just like the production of anything else, automobiles or cell phones, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the political economic system shapes and structures all of the ways that we mobilize land, labor, and capital. And we've known for at least a century that the capitalist system will use land, labor, and capital in ways that will primarily benefit the capitalist class and the accumulation of ever more capital in ever fewer hands, with no regard to the ecological devastation that we're wreaking upon the earth, and no regard to the what happens to working people, in that process. And so we need to return to a broader understanding of the need for a transformation of the overarching political economy. We had many decades of, liberation struggles that attempted to first decolonize from the European powers and then institute mostly socialist economies, which to one degree or another largely failed, in part based on the systematic military infiltration and destruction of the socialist liberation leaders in all of the newly decolonized nations that happened from the period of the 1950s through the late 1970s, and the return of the colonial global political economy through the instruments of the global capitalist class, the World Bank, the IMF. We're currently seeing the rebellion against that in Kenya, right? We have to have the hope and the possibility that new generations will produce a shared vision and organized struggle to transform the political economy, not necessarily to the state socialist systems that failed for various reasons in the past, but perhaps to new political possibilities that would be based on more direct and decentralized community control, the devolution of power as far as possible. We could be inspired by processes like the Zapatista process in southern Mexico, where you have an entire region that was never fully colonized either by the Spanish or by the Mexican nation state, and you have indigenous control in a sort of federated, decentralized process. We could talk about what's happening in Rojava and the liberation movement that's happened there, largely led by organized women fighting force that simultaneously had to resist ISIS and the Turkish state repression against the Kurdish people. And they've created sort of a democratic, confederalist, feminist, liberatory system that a lot of us are learning from. And there are other examples sort of spread around the world of people trying to say, you know, we can see that the globalized system of racial capitalism is devastating our ecology and is going to make our planet uninhabitable, and is continuing to produce systematic inequality between racialized categories of people and gendered categories of people in ways that are going to produce permanent tiny ruling class that becomes increasingly powerful and a much broader, the global majority. And we need to think about how could we create new revolutionary political subjects that can organize for and take power and transform our political economy to one that is a democratic, regenerative economy, and that the transition to that new form of economy, or those new forms of economy, because we want a pluriversal world with many local experiments possible, rather than a corporate monocultural world, which is what we're building towards right now. It's not survivable. We won't exist as a species if we continue on this path. And we need to organize and take political action and imagine new possible worlds. And we can do it, but it's hard to do. But if we don't even try, then we're certainly, on the path to planetary systems collapse. So the time is now, and the time is urgent. And anything that we do with advanced statistical tools that we call, under this marketing umbrella, AI, is going to be one small part of a broader process of social transformation towards a new political economy. Thank you.
So thanks, Sasha, for inspiring and thought-provoking session. I really enjoyed your interventions, but also the wide-ranging questions from our audience. I think it set us up for a great week and coming up, and a week after that, where we'll continue to ruminate and mobilize in pursuit of the visions that you've helped us to articulate today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Wish I could be there in person, but enjoy your time together.